Can I welcome everybody to this seminar on public understanding of economic statistics, which I think is a fascinating topic. As Alison said, I'm Mike Hughes from the RSS, and I'm chairing this presentation on behalf of the official statistics section. As you will be aware from the flyer for this event, the National Institute for Social and Economic Research has been conducting research on this topic since on behalf of the Economic Statistics Centre of Excellence and in turn on behalf of ONS. This research started in 2019 and has been conducted in a series of phases. And the first report on that phase was published in November last year. And the report on the second phase, which Johnny Runge will shortly be telling you all about, was published today to coincide with this presentation. And then you'll hear a little bit more about the next phase, phase 3, which has also started. So we're therefore fortunate to have the lead researcher from NIESR, Johnny Runge, to outline the research and the main findings from the research to date. And then we're privileged to have, as two discussants, Sumit Dey-Chowdhury, who's a senior economist at ONS, who sponsored this particular work, and he will respond both from his position in ONS and also as a professional and economist. And then I'm delighted to say Ed Humpherson, the DG, Director General of the Office of Statistical Regulation at UPSA, will offer his thoughts also relative to UPSA's current review on public statistics for public good. So rather than break the continuity of the presentations and the discussions, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and I will pick them up from there and invite you to speak. But without further ado, Johnny, can I hand over to you?
Yeah, of course. I'll just share my screen. Okay, perfect. You should be able to see it now. So yeah, thank you so much for organizing this webinar and for inviting me to speak. So the second part of the project that Mike spoke about is called What Can Economists Learn from Public Perspectives on the Economy and Economic Statistics? Did it together with Anna Killick from UCL and some advisors, including Mike himself. So it's part, as Mike said, of the research program of ESCoE funded by the ONS. And this part of that research program is looking at understanding how people think about economics and how they understand different economic concepts and statistics. And we think this is important because it's kind of a prerequisite to understanding how we can improve our communication to the public as economists and statisticians, and to kind of like build a stronger relationship and build trust with the general public. The research is covering a range of different things about the economy in general, but also about different economic concepts and stats. So the first report that we published a year ago, we did focus groups with 130 people and an online YouGov survey with 1,600 people. And it showed that public understanding of economic concepts is relatively limited on a range of issues, and that's something that got quite a lot of interest in the media at the time, especially on abstract issues related to the national economy, so things like GDP, government debt, and so on. But what got less attention at the time was the kind of expertise that we also highlighted on issues related to people's everyday lives and finances, where people could articulate quite nuanced and quite complex views, where people but where people quite often had kind of a different perspective to the kind of average economist. They would come at these things from a much more personal perspective, relying on personal and local experiences and so on. One of the main examples are interest rates, but also different aspects of other economic concepts and statistics. So a kind of broader finding of this was that the the public often view economics and statistics differently to experts from a different angle. Yes, we did identify a lot of misperceptions, misunderstandings, and so on, but we also demonstrated some of the insightful understandings coming from a personal perspective. So basically, one of the aims of this study that I'll be speaking about today was to kind of invite economists and economic statisticians into these focus groups, kind of show them what we experienced a year ago when we did this research. So get them closer to the public perspectives, getting them into workshops with the public where they can listen and speak to members of the wider public directly about some of these economic issues, and kind of seeing firsthand how people view the economy and how they react once they start speaking to them, how they react to their perspectives as economists. So we did 15 online workshops online, bringing 15 UK-based economists together with members of the public. And then we interviewed economists after the workshop to get them to reflect on what they had heard, what they had learned, and especially with making them reflect on how that experience could inform how they communicate with the public in the future. The economist was selected for a purposive sampling approach, trying to get as many different types of people, different seniorities, and people working in different types of organizations. So the final sample had economists working in public organizations, government departments, and researchers at universities, research institutes, and private companies, and so on. The public were recruited by a recruitment company, a variety of people from different backgrounds, different demographic characteristics, and we used the recruitment company and incentives and so on to make sure that we didn't just get the engaged and interested part of the public, but we really hit all different types of groups, including from all walks of life, including those that are not engaged in the economy normally. So what did we find? The first thing to say is some of our aims were achieved in the sense that economists found these workshops to be an effective tool to bring them closer to public's perspectives, and it was seen as a good way to reflect on how you communicate with the public. So people described it as very interesting, fascinating, stimulating, and so on. Some said that used the words that it was a good opportunity to get out of their own bubble, and many said that, or kind of reflected that it would be really useful for all economists or for a wider range of economists to get this type of experience in a similar type of setting, to get a better sense of public perspective, and especially those economists who would be interested in communicating to the public. They did, and in this way, the aims of the study was also achieved in the sense that the economists came to a lot of the same conclusions as we did a year ago, identifying a range of misperceptions and misunderstanding. For instance, that people are struggling with definitions and numbers and kind of the relationships between economic variables. But also, as we observed, economists were quite sometimes confounded, sometimes quite surprised about how rich the conversations were, and how nuanced and how robust the observations were, and kind of getting to some of the same conclusions as us, that it's sometimes just a matter of different perspectives. The public are seeing these things based on local experience and local and personal experiences, where an economist sees it slightly differently. This is just a quote of one of the economists who attended a workshop working in the labor market area, who said it was really illuminating to hear how people from different walks of life think about the economy and interpret economic statistics. It was also evident and rewarding to observe that people do engage with concepts such as unemployment and inflation, possess strong and nuanced intuitions about them, and find them relevant to their everyday lives. Since the first rule of communication is to know your audience, many economists and statisticians would benefit from having the opportunity to discuss economic statistics in a similar setting. And obviously, our report on the ESCoE website, focuses in on the Economist reflection. So there's loads of quotes and loads of considerations that the Economist had during the workshop. I'll highlight a few of them now. So on unemployment, the economists were quite often, the economists and statisticians who took part in the workshops were quite often struck by the concept of unemployment and unemployment rate, how a kind of like a simple concept like that and a fairly intuitive concept that actually the official definition is not necessarily intuitive for the general public, especially in relation to how statisticians and economists tend to measure this not as a binary measure, but as there are unemployed people, employed people, and economically inactive people. So a few of the economists in the workshop kind of reflected afterwards that they needed to be careful about taking for granted that a common understanding existed when they spoke about unemployment in the public debate. And kind of related to that, there was a lot of recognition among the participants that unemployment figures were not necessarily meaningful to people for the same reasons as what I just said, that some of those definitions were not intuitive to people, but also in relation to kind of like numeracy aspects and so on. But generally, it was clear to economists that unemployment was, that people thought the unemployment would be much higher, and there was a bit of skepticism, or a lot of skepticism, when in terms of the like relatively low unemployment figures compared to personal experiences. So some of the lessons that economists kind of emphasized afterwards was that to use figures more cautiously, or not at all in some cases, that actually figures can become can come a little bit in the way, and it's important to focus on the context and narrative, and potentially also complement figures with other ONS labor market indicators, maybe present them slightly differently. For instance, that different categories such as in work and out of work that might match public perceptions a bit better. So obviously that would mean saying, with the current labor market figures, instead of saying 75% of people are employed, 21% are economically inactive, 4.5% are unemployed, you might lead with the figures 75% of people are in work, 25% of people are out of work, and then kind of go on to explain what exactly are those 25% of people in working age, what are they doing, those who are out of work, and then you can go on to explain economic inactivity and so on. Generally, some economists also, they were not surprised at all, but because they have heard about these things and encountered it and stuff, but they were still struck by the lack of confidence in unemployment statistics. Having sat through the focus group, or the workshop as we called it, they saw that this partly at least stemmed from the disbelief in the figures, that 4.5% of people unemployed seemed very low, but also just a general assumption that the government might influence these figures, might influence the methodology to make it look good on government performance. So there were also a lot of kind of consideration among economists afterwards that it's important to emphasize the ONS as a source and the type of organization ONS is, and then potentially explain the methodology behind the numbers. Though explaining the methodology behind the numbers, as some of the economists and statisticians found out during the workshop, that can kind of come with its own problems, because the moment you start explaining about the labor force survey, for instance, that throws up completely new questions, such as sample sizes and surprise that's how the official figures are done. Inflation. So again, there's the same kind of story, that many economists were fairly impressed by people's knowledge of inflation as a concept, especially the kind of intuition and the understanding that rising prices has some practical implications for their spending power when there's stagnant wage growth, or if they haven't received any wage increases recently. So it's something that came out to economists, that obviously inflation is very relevant to people's lives, to people's personal finances, that people really recognize the personal relevance. Sometimes that relevance kind of vary. People have very different lived experiences. When they talk about prices and price changes, they focus on very different goods and services. We would say they have different implied shopping baskets, sometimes due to their different consumption patterns, but also sometimes just because they tend to focus on different parts of their consumption. But what was very obvious to the economists we spoke to was that people have very strong knowledge of inflation. They also have very strong knowledge of interest rates, especially on the personal aspects. So inflation relative to wage growth. They have typically very strong understanding of interest rates, particularly how it affects their borrowing or mortgage rates, or how it impacts their savings. But what they understand much less, and they're quite often very intrigued about this, but they do recognize that it's a bit of a mystery to them, is how this all relates together with each other, how inflation, the role of inflation in the broader economy. So kind of looking ahead to in a couple of days' time, when the Monetary Policy Committee from the Bank of England announced that their whether interest rate goes up or stays the same, and so on. On the surface, the public are able to understand a lot in these stories. They understand what inflation is. They understand what interest rates are. They have strong views about whether it's good for inflation to go up or down, and whether it's good for them that interest rates go up and down. But what they don't understand is how these things relate to each other. What is monetary policy? Who are the Bank of England? What's the inflation target? Why do they set the interest rate the way they do? And I think in an environment where this might become more and more important in the coming months, it's a very important opportunity for the economics profession to kind of communicate that relationship better, and kind of get people beyond just talking about fiscal policy as well. There were also a lot of reflections on inflation statistics, how they're presented, and whether they're currently presented in a way that's meaningful to the public. So some economists talked about that it was clear, and sometimes people said this very directly, the public participants, that this figure doesn't mean anything to me. People do often recognize that it is an aggregated figure that doesn't take into account their personal circumstances, household composition, their region, their consumption pattern, and so on. So some of the economists and statisticians spoke at length about how can you make this statistic more relatable to people. Can you do some different kind of inflation rates based on your demographic group? So different kind of considerations about how you can make this inflation number personal, whether it's having different types of shopping baskets, that's shopping baskets for older people, which will be different, which will be slightly different, or shopping baskets for younger people, or anything kind of like in between, and so on. Or there's also mention of the inflation calculator that was previously run and published on the BBC, but is no longer publicly available. And there was this kind of recognition that actually at the moment we are collecting and presenting inflation statistics in a way that's very much used to inform policymakers, especially the Bank of England. But given the public is so incredibly interested in this, are we really presenting it in a way that meets the public's demand for information, and that really fulfills this requirement of statistics serving the public good more directly? Okay, so GDP, I just wanted to mention quickly, but the findings are very similar to our previous ones and very simple. In fact, there is, the economists fully recognized, as we have seen in our other studies, that there's very limited understanding of GDP among the public. The term is not particularly helpful, regardless of whether you use the acronym or whether you use gross domestic product. People often say it's economic jargon. They have often heard it before, but it's one of those things that make them say that economics is inaccessible. It makes them change the channel when people start talking about GDP and so on. And another thing is, some economists noted that even for public participants who kind of broadly understood what GDP was, kind of could say, it's related, it measures the size of the economy, it relates to the health of the economy, and so on. The term was still seen as, so I think someone has needs to unmute their phone, microphone. Cool. The term was still seen as abstract and very difficult to relate to. So when survey findings usually find, when you do a kind of multiple choice question, there's usually around 50% of the British public who can define, picking the right option from 5 options. They can do, so 50% of the public can define GDP, but this really overestimates the kind of extent of the knowledge people have. Those 50% really don't engage with this concept very well. I think a lot of the solution to this is in all the kind of beyond GDP studies of how to the alternative measures of measuring well-being and so on, where that could potentially be more interesting to the public, and that they would engage more in. Then public finance is just as the last economic concept before I start talking about some of the kind of broader recommendations coming from this. These groups were done at the start, so February, March this year. So economists were not surprised again, but they were still quite struck by the little awareness of the workings and mechanism of government borrowing. The public participants described it as a mystery where the money comes from. Assumptions included that the money was borrowed from the World Bank, the IMF, other countries, and we have also done additional research on this in terms of people's perceptions of this part of COVID, and it's something that people don't understand, but they're incredibly interested in. And some economists in these groups describe COVID as a missed opportunity to improve public understanding in this area. It's like slightly probably past that opportunity now. I would say the opportunity in terms of the current topical areas is maybe more on like interest rates, monetary policy, inflation, and so on. But it is quite staggering how we have gone through a period where government debt and government borrowings were so high on the agenda. And as an economics community, we have not, based on our interviews, which we have done throughout the last 2 years, there's been a huge uptick in interest in this area, but very little change in actual understanding. Economists were also struck by how deeply embedded the household analogy is, and how these perceptions that government needs to live within its means, that it's similar to a household who cannot consistently spend more than it receives in income. These views are they're very apparent, and at the time when government borrowing was quite high up on the agenda, most public participants would say that the government inevitably would have to pay back the COVID debt soon, and they dreaded and didn't think it would be fair, but they expected large tax increases in the future. In more recent interviews, it's kind of like sometimes when it comes up, people wonder, why does this not really happen? They were expecting much higher tax increases, and kind of wonder how did we manage to spend so much money on the different support mechanisms without having to do this. And again, a kind of demonstration that they are very unsure about this area. Economists reflected a lot on this, often not really coming to a conclusion, but kind of like very much appreciating that the problem here is that the household analogy is very simple. It's very relatable. It's kind of what you are often told and what they, you know, and other concepts, that this is the way to communicate statistics, and they really struggled to come up with equally effective ways to explain the more complex picture. But there was also a recognition that if we keep, I mean, one of the recommendations of this is to communicate more in a more simple and relatable way. But there was also a recognition among some of the participating economists that this only takes you so far. Part of the difficulty of communicating economics is that actually especially in terms of the relation between variables, sometimes it's not very intuitive, sometimes it's not very simple and not very logical. So sometimes we need to like get beyond these simple and relatable ways of communicating as well. Okay, so I'll just briefly, before we hand over to some of the panelists, go through some of the recommendations and implications of this research. So I think the research has shown, and the ease with which we recruited economists and statisticians for this shows that there is appetite and a clear interest among the economics and statisticians community to engage more directly with the public, and they perceive substantial benefits to understanding public perspectives in more detail, and from our point of view, we think that future projects could roll out similar workshops and other public engagement activities, potentially on a much larger scale, you know, giving the opportunity a wider range of economists to get the chance to listen to public perspectives in their area and kind of like draw their own conclusions about how that could inform their communication efforts, and in some cases also inform their studies, their study designs, and so on itself. From our view, we're very interested in talking to different organizations about this. Organizations might have the opportunity to do some of this work themselves, and we will be very pleased to kind of talk to them and discuss how best to go about it. But from our point of view, we are also trying to kind of like do a bigger application where we kind of open it up to the wider economics community and statistics community to try to have a public engagement exercise similar to this one, but possibly also like having a wider public engagement activities. There's also clear interest among the wider public to engage directly with economists. It was very clear from both the post-workshop survey and what they said in the group that they really liked getting this opportunity to be with an expert face to face, one-on-one, or you know, four-on-one, and listening directly to an economist, you know, without that usual filter through the media and politicians. That was something they found incredibly valuable. Obviously, there are some constraints. It's much easier to hit a large proportion of economists and statisticians and really make it impactful in terms of informing economists' approaches and communication and so on. Obviously, public engagement exercises that kind of reach a meaningful proportion of the wider public is much more time consuming and expensive, but it still should be done as much as possible. There is also recognition that this will not be done overnight. We have highlighted that there is a lack of public understanding of economics in some areas, and improving that will not be done overnight. And some economists were really reflected afterwards and said that actually this has shown me that this will only be achieved with a sustained effort involving the wider economics community. It would involve integrating things like economics or statistics or economic statistics properly into the school curriculum, but it would also involve economic organizations considering their role in improving public understanding more. So some economists were very honest and upfront about their communication to the public. Many of them reflected after the workshop that actually the wider public is not one of our main audiences. It's very rare that they are discussed as one of the main audiences when we communicate research findings, for instance. And usually that would have been policymakers or other types of audiences like that would have been their main audiences. So there was some discussions about how do we provide the incentives for these organizations to start prioritizing public engagement and start prioritizing building trust with the public, which would benefit the whole economics community as a whole. Some of the more practical things were more focused on context, narratives, rather than always focusing on figures, make communication more simple and relatable, potentially produce separate parallel releases and outputs that are kind of aimed at the public. I'll speak a bit more about that specific recommendation in a bit. It also threw off some broader questions among the participating economists and statisticians about what do we actually expect the wider public to understand, because obviously we don't expect everyone to become proficient in complex economic theories and become like everyone getting undergraduate degrees in economics. That's not what we're saying, but where is the level that's of economic proficiency that's required for people, for non-economists to kind of handle their personal finances, to inform their personal decision making, and to understand the public debate about economic issues, and subsequently to inform their choices as democratic citizens. One of the things that came up is like sometimes we need to meet the public halfway, and instead of trying to explain to the public complex economic theories and how, for instance, how unemployment figures are, how they're exactly based on categories for working and non-working people, and about the ILO definition and so on. Actually, let's meet the public halfway and be like, okay, people understand labor market statistics in a very binary way. Either you're working or not working. Can we kind of be more accommodating and kind of present it in the way that people already understand? Because obviously there's nothing inherently wrong in that perception. The final thing is that economists sometimes struggle with how their communication is then filtered through, especially the media as an intermediary. So there were many lessons that economists and statisticians picked up during these workshops and in the reflection afterwards. But they also said sometimes this might be challenging to implement in practice. So a lesson like don't always use the numbers, use the context and narrative and so on. That could be incredibly difficult because they said journalists quite often love the number. It conveys a simple and powerful message, which is very, very important in a fast-paced news cycle. So one of the recommendations here is that future studies should explain this hypothesis more and also explain the relation between economists and journalists, with this, aim to reach a point where economists are able to support journalists better and also can see the media as an enabler of their communication rather than necessarily a barrier. And just in the end, and I might say more about this in the Q&A and discussions, but just to highlight some of our ongoing and future work, we are currently doing a stage 3 project, as Mike said, where we are kind of taking it the next step and designing and testing a parallel version of communicating the ONS labor market release to the public. So obviously what's on the ONS website at the moment is a version that needs to accommodate an incredible range of audiences, from like expert users and potentially all the way down to the less engaged public. So what we're doing here is actually imagine one day, either the ONS website or somewhere else, that there is a very accessible alternative parallel version to this labor market release that really explains the labour market statistics in a way that's easy to understand and engaging for the public. And then we will test that through different interviews and an experimental survey as well. Then we're also planning other projects on public engagement and communication. And as I said before, really at this stage, we would be really interested in collaborating and discussing with any organizations and doing work together on these issues. The more we can kind of engage different organizations and kind of really do this together as a community, I think the stronger the work will be. And I've also quite often presented to individual organizations and kind of internal seminars and kind of use that as a way of discussing in kind of an internal workshop what priorities that organization have in terms of the public audience, how they can improve their public communication and so on. So please contact me if you want to discuss any of these issues, also just to catch up on Zoom one day. Yeah, I'm done, so I'll just stop sharing my screen.
Excellent, Johnny. Thank you so much for that. Very, very huge amount of ground to cover in such a short space of time, but I think you've done that very well. I'm very grateful to you. For those that wish to look into this in a little bit more detail, if you look in the chat box, you'll now see a link to the report that has been published today, so you can pick up some of the detail in that. Thanks very much again, Johnny. Could I now turn to Sumit from ONS? Sumit is a senior economist at ONS, has been the sponsor, if you like, of this particular work. He's been Johnny's immediate customer for it, so I thought it would be very helpful to get his reflections on what's been learned to date, and both from the point of view of being an ONS member of staff, but also as a professional economist.
Thanks very much, Mike, and thank you for the invite to be here today. It's a real pleasure, both in a personal capacity, but also a professional one. So as Mike touched upon there, I kind of just want to reflect on some of Johnny's research so far, really from two perspectives. It's one, being a professional economist, particularly one in government, but also working in a national statistical institute where we are a service provider. And it's really what role there may be in terms of public engagement and wider public understanding. So one of the key, I guess, takeaways for myself was how this research has really highlighted the extent to which communications training needs to be much more integral, both in the professional environment for economists, but also I think the work of an NSI. I think this plays a really key role in terms of facilitating that conversation with the public in terms of their understanding of not only economics, but also public policy. Now, I think that requires much closer engagement with the public. And I think that's what this research has really shown me, that when I look back on my career, just the limited opportunities I've had to speak to that wider public and really understand the processes of the how, the what and the why in how they process information that relates to economics and public policy. Now, one of the key principles that we have here is statistics for the public good. And I think that's really underpinned by being a service provider to the public. So that goes beyond just the production of official estimates on the UK economy. But I think there's much more in terms of the collection, the dissemination and the understanding of that information. And I think more could be done to improve our collective understanding on how information is currently processed. Because for me, that's a key bit in terms of how does information become knowledge. And then a last reflection really is the feedback process. And I think Johnny touched upon this a little bit. Just that opportunity to speak to the wider public gave me insights in terms of feedback, in terms of how information is communicated and how it is understood. And I think that can all be underpinned a little bit more about more focus on communications training, but also a little bit more on that wider engagement. Now, I kind of want to reflect upon three core takeaways that I took when I was speaking with Johnny over the last 18 months or so. The first one is almost the lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic itself. Now, I think one of the key features there is that in terms of explaining the economics of COVID-19 or the impact on the UK economy, that's actually been relatively straightforward because it's a turning point that every one of us can identify with. We've all lived through this pandemic and continue to do so. So the very channels in which the economy is impacted becomes much more explicit because you can see it with your own eyes. It's very evident in the day-to-day transactions that we all take part in. So if in explaining how it is that the UK economy, for example, contracted by 10% last year, it's actually very easy to talk about things like public health restrictions and voluntary social distancing. And the extent to which a tightening and lifting of these restrictions over time is impacting upon how much output is produced and by which industries. Likewise, we can easily communicate how we talk about changes in the size and composition of our spending, because we've all experienced how we spend less on service A, B, and C and more on good X, Y, and Z. And if you think about that, then you can build on those principles from a perspective of, well, what's happened to the saving ratio, for example? What is this concept of forced versus precautionary saving? Or why is there inflationary pressures right now? So it's kind of building on these, I think, everyday principles that really sets a platform for helping facilitate this conversation with the wider public. And then a third simple example would be what's happened on the public finances. And again, I think there is not a person in the UK that's not familiar with furloughing as a concept. And again, I think you can explain when you look at things like net borrowing or net debt, it's not too much of a stretch to kind of explain these concepts in a relatively straightforward way. And that's been reflected in my kind of engagement, both formally and informally. If I look back over the last 2 years, just speaking with friends and family, there's now an interest in what I do as a profession and what I work on. So for me, it's quite clear that there is that wider interest in this very topic. But I've been fortunate to speak in kind of various public forums, whether it be lectures to undergraduate economists, careers fairs, or even forums like today. And it's quite clear to me that there is the interest there, and you can engage people with this material just because we're living through it now. So for me, one of the key takeaways from the COVID-19 experience is, how can we build upon this when we talk about the economy, whether it be in more normal times or whether it be in future turning points? And if I look back to the financial crisis, it's clear to me in terms of communications, that was in a very different space. A second reflection under COVID-19 really would be the statistical frameworks in which we're governed by here, working in an NSI. Now, that's obviously integral to how we go about producing official estimates, and the kind of the concepts and the principles are almost non-negotiable in terms of producing official estimates. But I think the thing that I've taken away from it is how you can take robust frameworks like the national accounts, but actually translate that to plain English. And I'll come up with a couple of examples later. But it's very clear to me that while I can, and I have done this, written about these technical subject matters to a technical audience, I don't think it is that much more effort to how can we explain this in simpler, plain language. And I think this is where flexibility comes a little bit more. So example may be if we look at a statistical bulletin, and I think next week we have the quarterly national accounts. I know that first line will have the words gross domestic product, but does that mean anything to anyone? Does the average person or even the average economist really distinguish between gross and net, or what's produced domestically versus what's produced by nationals? I'm not convinced that's the case. I think what's shown is that if you just talk in language like the output produced by an economy or the spending that takes place in the economy, it's so much simpler. And you still get to the same endpoint in effect in terms of that broader public understanding. Another example might be the balance of payments. And if I'm talking to an economist audience, I might be talking about the extent to which a country is a net lender or net borrower and how that might be financed by the rest of the world. But I can also just talk about how it reflects the UK's international transactions. And it's a lot easier talking about simple concepts about trading goods versus trading services, or how dividend payments may be reflected in investment income. And so I think there's this scope to be a little bit more flexible. I think we still adhere to these concepts. That's an absolute must. But I think the communication around those numbers can be much more tailored to the end user. And then my final reflection under COVID-19 is really the proliferation of real-time indicators. That's really been one of the key standouts in this pandemic from an economist's perspective, and how there's an increasing use for nowcasting or forecasting capabilities to kind of gauge what impact we've had on the UK economy. But the thing I think that's been almost overlooked as part of real-time information is just its impact on communication, because this tends to, in terms of soft indicators at least, relates to everyday transactions. I don't have to worry about a gross domestic product when I think about a real-time indicator. So if I look at examples in terms of how hospitality has been impacted, we could look at things like hotel bookings or restaurant bookings. Even this week, we've moved into a plan B where there is now in England stay at home from a kind of a guidance perspective. Well, it's easy to kind of look at transport flows, for example, to kind of capture how the economy is responding to these types of restrictions. And likewise, travel, when you can think about the number of flight bookings taking place or flight numbers. And so I think real-time information actually has this potential to enhance how we communicate what's going on in the economy, because it's everyday types of transactions that are a lot easier to relate to. And the one I should have highlighted was really mobility indicators, particularly in that first lockdown. Now, of course, these real-time indicators, their predictive power changes over time, and the relationships to the real economy are going to be evolving, and they're not going to be the same for all future states of the economy. But I'm hoping there is that potential where we can kind of communicate in, as I say, terms of how it's impacting people today. And I think that gets to the kind of personal economy context that Johnny was referring to earlier. So my second core reflection was really the types of communication. And this is really, I think, we could do more to tailor our communications to our end user. So I think one of my reflections has been there really is a one-size-fits-all model. I think while I understand maybe that move towards finding a common denominator in our communications and our language, I'm not convinced that meets any of the needs particularly that well. I think what we need is tailored communications to actually adapt to what individuals need. So if I take a couple of examples in terms of technical challenges I've worked on over the last 18 to 24 months. One has been the recording of non-market output in the national accounts. Now, there's been a review written on that, and that will form conferences in the domestic and international community. And I could talk endlessly about that, and you'd appreciate I won't do that today. But I also think there's a scope to actually explain that in really straightforward English. If I take education as an example, essentially what we wanted to capture was the effect of the pandemic, and particularly those public health restrictions, in terms of the impact on teaching in schools. And so instead of talking about sum of cost or volume indicators, you can kind of talk in plain English about, well, what we were trying to capture is effectively what were the number of pupils that were getting equivalent teaching in a given period. And you can do that with plain blogs. You could do that with infographics. And I think that's something we need to explore a lot more. I think statistical bulletins, and I'm not saying those can't be improved, but I think they do serve a purpose. I just don't think they serve a purpose in terms of the Joe blogs on the street. So I think we need to be a little bit more open-minded about how do we engage people, and this may be a scope for alternatives to statistical bulletins. I think there's also room for technical notes, and this is what I often write, but I'm never writing those with the wider public in mind. But that's not to say I could engage with the wider public and write a blog or even do a podcast. Digital media, I think, is increasingly becoming a more prominent form. And if we really want to engage with the wider public, and I include youngsters in this, I think we need to be a little bit more responsive or cater to those needs. Another example might be consumer price inflation. And I could, if I wanted to, talk to you about Lispear's price indices and the challenges of a fixed base rate that is prior to the pandemic. But equally, I could just talk about, well, the pandemic has led to large changes in what we consume. And again, relate that to the individual. There are fewer trips to, whether it be hotels and restaurants or pubs or music venues, sporting venues, and you kind of just relate it to what people experience. And I think that combination is something that we could explore much more. And I think it's also something around maybe phraseology. So a couple of examples over the last 18 months I've noticed. And this has been led by the Bank of England to talk about kind of two episodes that's taken place in the COVID-19 pandemic. One was the response of financial markets last March. And while it was essentially an extreme flight to safety, there was a tagline of the dash for cash, which just has almost a public resonance, I can believe. And then a more recent one is the so-called race of space, which is trying to explain the recent increase in house prices and how there's been a shift in preferences. Now, we can talk about the real economy and the financial economy in those examples, but what I quite liked about those were again, everyday language, which might seem a little cheesy, but I quite like in terms of just engaging because it's material that we all understand. And so I think there's something there around how we can think about how information is processed. And then my third and final reflection is what Johnny's recent piece of research, so the one that was published today, which is the potential for future focus groups. And I think this is one of the most interesting bits of the research for myself, because I was involved in one or two of those focus groups. And it was probably one of the very first times I'd had the opportunity to engage with the wider public. I've been quite fortunate that I've done recent work with universities, which gave me exposure to undergraduate economists very early in their careers. But this, with those people in mind, they still have an economics, some priors there. And I think what typically we focus on as stakeholder engagement is what I call our core users. So the likes of policymakers or forecasters or research institutions. And there's, and I've worked in those places as well, which has given me this insight as to how do I communicate to my target audience. But what I often forget is, well, I was once a member of that wider public in terms of not being an economist, but I've not really had that opportunity to put myself in the shoes. How do I write for the person on the street? And so while I think, and I'd like to believe the ONS has had a very effective 18 to 24 months through the COVID-19 pandemic and has done it very well in terms of its communications, I was, in terms of my own work, really focusing on those core users. And I really wanted to understand the perspective of the public. And how do people view the economy from their perspective? And how do people understand these concepts? So for me, it was providing that insight into that kind of journey, that process in terms of how individuals actually take and receive information and then translate that into knowledge. So one example that came to mind was thinking about employment or unemployment. And I just always took it as given that, you've got employment, you've got unemployment and inactivity. And I never particularly challenged those principles. But then you think about it, it's like, well, it's quite understandable why people think either employment as a binary concept, you're either working or you're not. And then you've got the distinction between levels of employment and then hours worked. And so it became then really clear as I was just listening in on these conversations, things that I just took for granted, either just being understood by all or accepted by all, weren't really the case. Inflation is another one in terms of the extent to which people relate to a headline inflation number. And of course, your own inflation is going to reflect the goods and services you consume, but there's also going to be ones that are more observable in terms of, I guess, immediate price changes. And I guess a classic example might be going to a petrol forecourt. And it wouldn't surprise me if a lot of people base their inflation on the numbers when filling up your vehicle. Alternatively, it might be just when you're doing everyday goods and services. But to what extent does that reflect the reality? So I think this concept of the personal economy is a really important one. I think where there is the challenge, but I think there is the opportunity as well, is to bridge, I guess, between the macro national economy and this personal one. I'm probably less inclined to, I guess, produce alternative official numbers. I think Johnny spoke about the ILO concepts earlier. I still think that needs to govern our headline labour market figures, but I think there's much more we can do in terms of particularly lower level regional insights, which may relate a lot more to personal reflections or experiences. I think with personal inflation, I do appreciate there are challenges around that. But again, I think I remember when that was first launched in the mid 2000s, and I could see it was really just interesting seeing the distribution of experiences. And I think that's something we could do more about, because it's really these between and within effects that I think matter from an individual perspective. So that really kind of concludes my main reflections on Johnny findings. I think there is more we can do in terms of improving the effectiveness of communications. I think there is the appetite from both a public perspective, but also from the perspective of a stats office and the economist profession. And I'll be interested to see how we may be able to take that forward. So thank you very much for listening there.
Sumit, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating, both to hear your personal perspectives on all of this, but also your insights, but also your conclusions to date from the research. I, like you, sat in on a number of the focus groups, and I must confess that this whole concept of a personal economy was one that struck me very much. You know, the fact that people have great difficulty in accepting that people on 0 hours contracts were properly in work, etc., etc. So I do think there's still a lot to be done in that particular domain, and not for discussion here with just now, but I do think this whole question of slavish adherence to international definitions is part of the issue and the problem. But I heard you say that, you know, we must stick to some ILO definitions. Anyway, thank you so much, Sumit. That was fascinating. And last but not least, I'd now like to turn attention to Ed, who's waited there patiently. And if I could just take a moment, Ed, just to read out what Article 7 of the Statistics and Regulation Act says by way of introduction. In the exercise of its functions, the board is to have an objective of promoting and safeguarding the production of official statistics that serve the public good. And I sat on the steering committee, the Treasury Steering Committee, which developed the Act. And that particular phrase, public good, was deliberately put in there to counter the Rayner principles of the 1980s, when statistics were only produced for government purposes. So I'm fascinated to hear what you may have to say about the review and the research you've been undertaking so far in terms of how far that particular article in the Act is being pursued.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. On the Rayner principles, I've always wanted to do a presentation which is pantomime style, where whenever the Rayner principles are mentioned, the whole audience boo, boo. It doesn't really work in an online context, I'm afraid. But when we're next all together, we'll do it. Well, whenever the Rayner principles, everybody has the boo. So, and the other thing to say, apologies, Mike, I promised I wouldn't use slides, but I was so inspired by what we've just heard from Johnny and Sumit that I've actually quickly done some slides while they were talking. So I'm actually going to share my screen because there's a point which I think I can get across better using slides. So hopefully, can you now see my slides?
Goodness me, such extemporization is...
Well, it's mostly cannibalizing existing work, but there is some new content in here as well. Can you see that?
Yes,
So,
thank you.
Very quickly, we are the Office for Statistics Regulation, as Mike has said, regulatory arm of the UK Statistics Authority, promote and safeguard the production and publication of official statistics. There's a couple of words that Mike read out which are missing. Don't worry, they're coming very shortly in this presentation. And basically, through the Code of Practice for Statistics, we set the standards for UK public sector publishing statistics. Our vision, in line with the Act, is that statistics serve the public good, and that is a really meaningful thing for us. And we are very clearly distinguishing statistics that serve a broader public from statistics that serve government decision-making, ministerial decision-making, Bank of England decision-making. We are targeting this broader notion of the public good. We are doing some research into that. My colleague Mary Cowan, I think maybe on the call, is leading a research programme. And the reason we have the research programme is that this notion of the public good has been relatively taken for granted, I would say, in the official statistical system. If you were to ask people who produce official statistics, the question, do your statistics serve the public good? The answer would probably be yes, of course they do. But then what would sit behind that? The empirical demonstration of that might be a little bit less at everybody's fingertips. And we wanted to explore actually how to think about the public good provided by statistics. Our research program began with a literature review, which you can see on our website. And we have recently published a different perspective, which is actually how researchers who apply to access for administrative data, how they think about the public good, because they have to write out an application form. And one of the things they have to do in that application form is say how their statistics, how their research rather would serve the public good. And we thought that'd be a very useful sort of revealed preference. And what it essentially reveals is that researchers interpret the public good as making policy better. Essentially, that's the essential common theme through most of the research applications. So that's the researcher perspectives piece. We've got 2 pieces of work currently underway on public perspectives on the public good provided by statistics. The first is the Public Confidence in Official Statistics Survey, PCOS. That's a survey which comes out roughly every 2 years and tracks over time public confidence. We've added in a suite of questions to this survey, which is currently in the field. So in the first half of next year, we'll get some results from that. We're also with an organisation called Admin Data Research UK exploring doing some qualitative work around how people understand the idea of the public good of statistics and data. And finally, we are turning our lens on ourselves, and we're actually doing an exercise to look at our own work and say, well, how do we talk about the public good provided by statistics? Are we consistent? Are we using this term in a kind of precise and well thought through way, or in a vague way? So that's the kind of background, sort of why we are talking about this at all. The key thing I wanted to say, though, was why I really love the work that Johnny has done. And I think I love it because it provides 3 important perspectives on statistics, and 3 perspectives, each of them tend to be neglected. The first is statistics. This is the new content, Mike, by the way. This is stuff that I've done just now. Statistics in people's lives. And the reason I say that is that I think there's a very strong tendency to think that statistics play a role in decisions made by organizations, public sector organizations, companies, and so on, but to rather downplay the fact that individuals, citizens, members of the public themselves engage with statistics. They hear them on the news, they read about them in social media, they might hear other people talking about them, and statistics sort of have a resonance. It may be that their understanding of them is not exactly the same as the experts' understanding of them, but that's not to downplay this is an important part of the life of statistics. And I think that Johnny's work really brilliantly brings that out. I think the example of unemployment is absolutely superb in illustrating that people do think about these things. They might think about them differently from the professional economist community, but that doesn't delegitimate the fact they are thinking about them and can engage with them and can observe the world around them. And statistics play a part in that. So I really like that perspective. The second is maybe very predictable from me, because if you look at any of the reports that the Office for Statistics Regulation produces, we talk about the essential need for user engagement, for the people who produce statistics to engage with the people who use them. And Johnny said that it's important to think about context and narratives, things to be simple and relatable, and so on. And Sumit spoke very eloquently, I thought, about the plain English. Those are both insights which emerge from a real focus on user engagement. So I really love the way that in a sense, Johnny's work is a kind of an extended exercise in user engagement and a really good example of how to do this. That's tremendous. And the third thing that I like about Johnny's work is that I think it bears on an issue that increasingly I see coming up when I talk at events. People quite often ask me about my views on statistical literacy, and I always say the same thing, which is that it's a mistake to think about statistical literacy being something that some people have and other people lack. if you say that there are some people who are statistically literate and other people who are less literate and therefore need to have their literacy raised, you're kind of basically operating a deficit model. You're assuming that some people have a deficit and other people that don't have that, and therefore you get into a sort of a notion of, well, we've got to educate people to address their literacy. And I've always felt uncomfortable with this because I think it's quite firstly quite an elitist view, but secondly, I'm not sure it's right. I think there are plenty of people who've got really good grasp of statistical concepts, but just in different ways than the ways that, so to speak, the official system recognises. David Norgrove, my chair at the UK Statistics Authority, talks about his own father, who left school. He says this is his story, but left school at 14, had no really very strong formal education, but was brilliant in the bookies, could cope with the odds really, really quickly and easily, and do, you know, fantastic mental calculations. What I like about Johnny's work is that it bears on this in exactly the right way. Johnny is not going to this and assuming that the people who he's talking to are kind of deficient in their understanding of economic concepts. They have an understanding, they have a take on it. It's not the same as the experts, but it's worth engaging with. And then the task for the official system is not to educate people out of their illiteracy. The task of the statistic system is to understand the levels of literacy that people have, or understand the ways people understand statistics, and then engage with those and communicate in ways which engage, which is why what Sumit said was absolutely spot on about plain English and relatable concepts. That's exactly the right way to think about it. So I really love Johnny's work. I think it all bears on the public good. Those three things come together to focus on that phrase that Mike picked out right at the beginning, and which is at the centre of our work. This is how to get to the public good provided by statistics. So I love Johnny's work. I've got one more slide, which I think is worth sharing as well, because it's not just Johnny's work that I love. Johnny's work is sponsored, supported by ESCoE, the Economic Statistics Centre of Excellence, a relatively new body, ESCoE, which channels research into economic measurement to help ONS and others improve what they do. And that's exactly what Johnny clearly is doing, but it's what ESCoE does more generally. So I just want to close by saying this. You can see it's a very hastily done slide. I ran out of time to do the words, so I had to use a symbol. I think ESCoE is a really fantastic institution and has brought tremendous benefits, and this is a really good example of its work. Thank you very much. I shall stop sharing my screen and hand back to you, Mike.
Thank you very much, Ed. That was also very stimulating to hear the perspective from AXA, and certainly I greatly appreciate the extemporization there with your slides on the hoof, but they all made a great deal of sense, so thank you very much for that. We've now got several questions in the chat box, and let's see if we get more. Start with one from Sheila Page. Sheila asked a question about shopping baskets. Do you want to ask the question yourself, Sheila?
Has that unmuted me? Can you hear me now or not?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Yes, and really extend it a little, drawing on some of the things the commentators said. There seems shopping basket was something which in Johnny's first report, he said tended to mislead people and shouldn't be used. So I was slightly surprised when he started using it in almost every other slide this afternoon. It's not really a word that you see economists using as a simplification. It's a politician's simplification, like the economy as a household simplification. And it struck me that one of the problems is simplification, and one of the remedies that we're hearing is, well, specification, making much more specific things, big data approaches, transport data, sales of pubs rather than services. And should we be thinking much more in terms, not that data needs to be simplified, because if you simplify, you end up with nonsense, but that they need to be brought down to much more specific. And we can do that now. We actually don't need surveys nearly as much as we did 50 years ago, because we have the big data more or less instantly. We can get it we don't have to guess how many, do a survey of how many rail journeys are being taken. We actually can get the data. So is this really a plea both to statistics providers and to economists talking about statistics to talk about specific data rather than any simplifications, and indeed rather than GDP? Thank you.
Should I go first? And thanks for your question, Sheila. I agree with all of that. The simplification, it's both, and making things more relatable can both be good and an evil, in the sense that it's great to simplify and make things more relatable if that kind of like enhances people understanding. Sometimes that might, miss some like nuances that economists feel very uncomfortable about, like missing out on, if it's then only like 98% correct. But in a lot of cases it's a good way. But in some cases the simplifications kind of like work to further confuse people, or to relate it to a concept such as the shopping basket example, or like a household budget. And then it leads to actual misunderstandings by kind of like associating it with something that people are familiar with, but is working differently. So in terms of like when to use different words, that's obviously again all about audience. You wanna kind of tailor your communication to different audiences, and definitely, as you say, the using words like shopping basket and basket of goods and services and things like that would definitely not be very advisable to a public audience. Yeah.
Do you have any views, Sumit, given your thoughts on simplification?
So probably a couple of reflections in the specific examples that were given. So I think in the example of a household and a government, there's one where I don't think it's helpful at all. So I think I'd agree with Sheila's point there. I think the one with the shopping basket, I would probably be more relaxed about. That's probably, let me say, that's independent of Johnny's research when he spoke to the public. But if you were to say to me, do you think it'd be helpful? I could be. I'd be open-minded to communicating the latest CPI figures in the concept of a shopping basket of goods and services if people understood what inflation was capturing. So there's a subtle discrepancy between those two. The house on government, I think, actually leads to a misunderstanding, whereas with the first one, with the shopping basket one, it's not a given, though I do recognise Sheila's point about goods versus services. And I think one of the points I was trying to make into this big data, I think that could come out a lot more in communications. I think you've got to be a little bit careful in terms of, I think it's more to complement than a substitute, is my view on things like real-time indicators. And I think if it can complement understanding about channels in which the economy is being impacted, so transport would be one, I think it can be helpful. That's not to say it's the same concept as gross value added of the transport industry, but they need to write like that. So I think there is scope to draw upon some of these insights that people can understand and relate to a lot more.
Thank you, Sumit. Any thoughts on that one, Ed?
No, let's find time for some more questions.
Okay. There's a question from Alison McFarlane, the chair of official statistics, where she says, how can this approach be rolled out to statistics relating to other areas of public life? Sorry, Alison, I should have let you ask the question yourself, but I've said it now. How can this approach be rolled out to statistics relating to other areas of public life? Would you like to amplify that a little bit, Alison, by what you actually mean? How do you...
What I mean is...
Are you talking here about your own topic area of health or...
Well, I'm coming for that, but there are things which, as statisticians, that we've been aware of and are in the public data for many years, and yet there are people who are completely unaware of it. Just an example that struck me recently is in my area, which is inequalities in the outcome of pregnancy, and we've really been aware of decades of social and ethnic differences in infant mortality and preterm birth, and there have been decennial reports, there have been annual statistics published by ONS, and then suddenly we have what's called maternity and perinatal audit, which audits data about maternity care, has very limited socioeconomic indicators, and has analysed these differences, and despite having very poor socioeconomic data, found them to be there, and this has merited a publication in the Lancet and a comment that this is absolutely shocking. People wouldn't really know anything about it, and yet, and also the fact that their data is so crude as far as ethnicity is concerned that it's actually obscured some differences which are real. But how is it we were unable to get across to enable them to access the data that's been available for decades and looked at these problems, including the new Labour government had an infant mortality indicator and a target, and that was forgotten once there was a change of regime. And yet, this is an important area. This is an example, but I don't think it's unique. And how is it we were unable to get this across? The maternal deaths inquiry has discovered that black women are more likely to die in childbirth than white women, based on very small numbers, and yet when I was working with the person running the inquiry, I suppose about 15 years ago, we discovered that found that black African women had the highest mortality rates, but at that time, a third of the women who died were refugees and asylum seekers, and nobody picked this up at all.
So the question, Alison, basically is, wider application of this approach,
and how to sharing it with people to whom it's important.
Yeah.
And
could I come in here, Mike?
This is a generic one for you, really, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly, and I'm very happy to answer it. My view, essentially, given my enthusiasm for the work that Johnny has done, is that I think that Johnny's approach could easily be extended to other domains. I think probably not indiscriminately. I think you need to think carefully about what the appropriate domains were, and my proposition would be the way to extend it would be to target those areas of statistics where there seems to be some mismatch between what the statisticians, analysts think they are communicating and the public perceptions that arise on an issue. So two areas that I think might be really interesting to apply this approach to. One would be crime. Perceptions of crime versus the measurement of crime. I think there could be some very interesting parallels here to the way people react to unemployment, actually, people's perception of unemployment, people's perception of crime. And the other area possibly would be migration, people's perception of migration versus the actual measurement of migration. So yeah, I think Alison's proposition that this could be extendable to other areas is really good. I don't know enough about the specific area that Alison mentioned, but I think anywhere where you see this kind of mismatch, I think Johnny's approach is a really good way of opening it up and starting to think about what the producers of statistics in their communication might need to be taking on board. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aidan and Alison. Got a couple more questions in the chat box, if we can try and deal with those. If I could turn attention first to one from Peter Smith. Peter, can you pose your question about people's understanding of some of the economic parameters? Is he still there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Certainly, sir, yes.
Sorry to shout. Well, the first one was there's some very radical people who think that government can control all economic variables completely. And from what I understand, part of the reason that the thing that limits that is the fact that we've run on borrowed money, and the government runs on borrowed money. And if you can't get people to buy your bonds, you're pretty much stuffed. How widely is that realised? Sorry, that's what I want to say.
Yeah.
I gobsmacked everybody.
I'm not sure who's best placed to answer that one, Peter. Do you want to have a shot at that one, Sumit, as an economist?
I was hopefully going to Johnny there. I mean, the honest answer is I don't know the public perception. I guess this might come back to that earlier comment around to what extent are houses and governments comparable in terms of budget constraints and being able to finance beyond their means. Now, I don't think it's a useful analogy, but what I don't know is does the wider public agree with that? Do they understand the distinction between the two? Now, my gut instinct would be probably not, because I think there's probably a lot of economists who might not really quite appreciate. I'm sure there were economists who came up with some of these analogies to try to explain concepts of borrowing and debt. And so from a first principle, I can kind of understand, well, look, how do I explain fiscal numbers? Well, I'll try to relate it to the individual, because they will understand how much they borrow and what their debt levels are. So I imagine, I don't know, but I imagine that's where it came from. But then you kind of get into, as you said, the intricacies, or how does, to what extent does credibility in financial markets ultimately matter, to what extent governments can borrow or not? And then you see that in fiscal policy responses. So I guess there's probably two reflections I would have. And Johnny might want to come in on this, because I know he had a slide on public finances. I appreciate I haven't answered your question, so I think that's the first one. To what extent does the wider public understand essentially how governments function? But then I think an interesting point is, to what extent does this then translate to how fiscal policy is run? Again, and I don't want to get too much into politics off that, but there's clearly, when it comes to elections, political parties predicate their management of the economy on public finances. But I guess that, in a way, depends on does the average person, the voter, understand how that works? And I would imagine not. I think they will probably see it as fiscal prudence, more from a perspective of just getting borrowing and debt levels down, rather than why do you want to get those levels or changes down. So yes, it's a very tricky one, but I suspect the answer is the public doesn't know. But I don't know if Johnny wants to come in, just because I know he spoke directly on that topic.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things with this issue, but generally people in focus groups and interviews and stuff are incredibly they're very interested in it. They most often they completely recognize that we have a budget deficit and high government debt, and but they don't understand how that works, apart from like the household analogy type stuff that we need to raise taxes, and that's the only real way to reduce that deficit. Then, apart from that, they will have like kind of very isolated, specific knowledge that they have heard in a news program or read in the news or on social media or whatever. Printing money often comes up, that they've heard the government can print money, and they find that very curious and frankly very weird, and don't understand why you then have any debt at all. And generally, what happens is people, what we obviously do in these kind of focus groups and interviews is that we have those kind of like first responses, the kind of intuitive responses people have, but then we also, because we're discussing things in focus groups, people actually start to reflect on these concepts more than they've ever done. And it's actually very common in focus groups that then people start realizing, actually, in my own personal household, I am actually in debt as well, and it actually works out all right most of the time. So there are like it goes sometimes beyond those kind of like simplistic views. But one thing that's certain is that people want to know more about this, and that they are really engaged in it.
Thank you, Johnny. We're getting close to nearly finishing time. I did promise the three presenters that we would try and aim to finish at 3:30. We've still got a few questions in the box. I wonder whether we could just, if people don't mind, I take one from Matthew Powell. I think it is Matthew Powell, isn't it, Matthew? Is he there? Doesn't seem to be there. Matthew? Matthew had a question on price indices, on RPI versus CPI, but we'll come back to that. David Matz had a number of questions to ask. I don't think we'll have time for all three of them, David, but do you want to pose the first one in your chat box?
Yes, certainly. It's just a question of sort of what people think about this, the model of like the Science Media Centre. I mean, we have in migration, there's, various experts who come in and get asked by the media, what do you think about the latest figures? And that is a very good way of getting, information out there, because you don't expect Joe Public to read stats bulletins. I know the Science Media Centre do lots of things for academics launching research and get them, and it's just, if we think there's a problem, is it, are we really going to solve it by doing lots of different versions and different ways of doing stats releases, or is it really by working more closely with the people who actually do it in the media? That's probably the summary. But so is that a model that you would see what the panel think about that?
Thanks, Mike. Can I quickly give a first answer to that? I'm a big fan of the Science Media Centre. I think they do a really tremendous job. So much so, and this is where I'm going to hand over to Johnny, that I put Science Media Centre in contact with Johnny to say, Johnny, what do you think of the Science Media Centre? Is there something to learn? Johnny, do you want to pick it up from there?
Yeah, I think it's a great approach as well, and I mean, obviously, I've spoken to them now and looked a lot at their work, and I really think it's a model that, given it's successful in the science space, I frankly don't understand how we really should think about doing something similar. We are currently doing, so in the third phase of the project, we are doing interviews with journalists and trying to kind of like explore how journalists are reporting different ONS releases, how they feel supported by the economics community, and kind of with the aim of trying to understand what the economics community can do better. Because I think when we interview economists, quite often they kind of blame journalists for bad reporting, and I think we should probably turn look a little bit inwards as well, and consider whether we are doing enough ourselves to support journalists, and whether we are making their lives as easy as it could be. And we are doing content analysis and different kind of things as part of this project, and the kind of like early findings of that, not to reveal anything, is that actually when a lot of media outlets are kind of like very close to the different ONS releases and different, from other economic organizations. So I think there's a lot of kind of scope to drive what journalists end up communicating to the media, and we should take advantage of that ability if we don't think the media and journalists are doing it properly at the moment.
Fine. Thank you very much then. I think I must draw a line under it now. But to first of all thank the three of you for what has been a very worthwhile and interesting, stimulating discussion. And to thank all of the audience for their questions as well. And if I could just read, if you'll bear with me, I thought quite a novel send-off, a note from Australia, from a guy called Scott. No question, just wanted to give thanks for an interesting discussion. It was worth staying up until 2:30 to listen to. So that's from Scott Marley in the Labour branch of the Australian Bureau of Statistics. I think that's a nice way to finish off. So thank you very much, all three of you, for very, very interesting seminar. Many thanks. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take
Bye.
care.